Dudaei Reuven continues. He says as follows. He says, okay, so now let's talk about why does the king have the responsibility to make 2 Torah scrolls? So he says, just like just like everybody has an obligation to write a Torah scroll for themselves and not to receive the Torah scroll that he receives from their father, because you can't just choose your path in life literally based upon what your parents told you to do. You have to make your own path. But so too, everybody has to make a new path. However, everybody only has to write 1 Torah. But the king has to write 2 Torahs. Why? Because the king has double responsibility. He has the responsibility that every individual does to fulfill the path of finding his path of the Torah. And also it's his responsibility to lead the whole country. And so that the whole country is living or existing in a path of the Torah. This is what he writes. The says it's the king's responsibility in his path to bring all of the people of the country to be based upon the Torah scroll and to based upon the tradition we receive at Sinai. The path of the country needs to be reflective of the Torah scroll. And the Torah of Har Sinai, the king has to draw from this and to draw down the kingdom. What does it mean when it says Som tasim alecha melech mikerav achacha? Means to say this is a national commandment that the nation is supposed to use the path of the Torah. The nation is supposed to use the path of the Torah to achieve its destiny. And each nation, each generation has its own path. Each generation is going to go on its own path and its own process. And that's why the king has to read it all the days of his life. That's why the king has to have 2 Torahs for his individual and national responsibility. This is the message of the Dudaei Reuven. I want to just pause for a second, see if anybody has any questions before we turn to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Hold on. So I definitely wanted to see what the Lubavitcher Rebbe would say about this, because the Rebbe himself, the Rebbe was a very humble man, but he was treated by his Hasidim like a melech. They treated him as like a king. They wouldn't, for example, now I could be speaking out of line, but I think that the Hasidim didn't touch the Rebbe. That was their practice because they viewed him as like a king. So I wanted to know what the Rebbe would say about this verse that you have to appoint himself a king. Especially the Rebbe kept talking about that you have to appoint a Melech HaMashiach, a king who was the Messiah. So Mashiach at its core is about Malchus, about sovereignty. So what does the Rebbe say about a Melech? So he writes as follows: the Torah has no opposition to the institution of monarchy. Indeed, the prophetic vision of the Messiah depicts him primarily as a king. So the Messiah is first and foremost the king. In general, there are 2 positive motivations for instituting a monarchy. So the Rebbe is in favor of a monarchy. Why? First, to provide society with a higher authority that can coerce it into compliance with the law. So a monarchy, if it's pure, can cause people to obey the law. And second, in as much as not everyone can attain the highest levels of spiritual refinement, it is appropriate to point someone who has reached these levels to inspire the rest of the people to evince that spirituality that they do not yet possess, but that he embodies, thus enabling them to vicariously experience his self-effacement before God. Here the Rebbe is clearly talking about a great spiritual leader who is the king, who's serving as the king. So the Rebbe is saying, first, what's the purpose of a king? one, to enforce the law, but two, to be a spiritual leader. This is the Messiah. And since not everybody can reach the highest spiritual level, the king will be on that level, and he'll inspire everybody to appreciate that level and to try to be a reflection of that level. So you can see why the Rebbe's Hasidim viewed him as the king, because they viewed him as the highest spiritual level, and they tried to be a reflection of that level. So he says the second reason of the fact that we need a great spiritual leader, this is necessary and relevant even when the people, let's say for example, you're in a very, very small village and your kingdom, just your village, and nobody there would ever violate the law. Nobody there would ever violate the mitzvos. Nevertheless, they need a king to help them reach that higher spiritual level. Then he says, in the absence of the formal monarchy, the role of a higher authority over ourselves. This is the line, which I think is why the Hasidim, above all, viewed the Rebbe as a king. He says, in the absence of a formal monarchy, the role of a higher authority over ourselves is filled by the rabbinic establishment. So this is why the Lubavitcher Rebbe, once he became the Rebbe, I think he never ever, some people who know the Rebbe better can correct me, but I think he never left 770. The only times he left was to visit his father-in-law's kever, to visit the grave, or he went to a couple times he went to the doctor's office. But he never went to, let's say, meet a politician or meet a philanthropist. They always came to him. And the reason is because he was the king. He was the king, and the king didn't go out to meet others. People came to visit the king. So he carried himself as though he was the king. And the sage, and that's because this is his source. What's his source? He says this is based upon Gittin 62a, and we just finished, by the way, Tractate Gittin. We just finished Tractate Gittin, and now we started yesterday Tractate Kedushin, which is about betrothal. So this is a source where the sages say, provide yourself with a teacher of Torah, with whom we should consult on all matters of spiritual life. And before his review and scrutiny, we should subject our progress on the spiritual path. And then the Rebbe says something which is so important to us. And this goes back to the first part we said. Remember we said you have to appoint a judge, and everybody has to accept the judge of their generation as though they are the judge of all, just as powerful as even Moses himself. But he says, don't think. He says, we should not delude ourselves into thinking that there's no suitable candidate to serve as our king, since no one is perfect and therefore capable of understanding us objectively. Don't say, okay, well, there's nobody around today who could be our king. Why? Because nobody's perfect today. Nobody has the ability to be like Moshe Rabbeinu. Nobody has the ability to be like Eliyahu Hanavi or Shmuel Hanavi. Nobody's on that level today. So therefore, we won't have a king. He says the Torah tells us, if we search properly and diligently, will we indeed find the mentors best suited to our spiritual needs. So what the Rebbe is saying is, in every generation, hold on one second. Excuse me. Apologize for that. Every generation has to appoint a king. Don't wait for the perfect king. And the perfect king today doesn't exist. But since today we're not going to appoint a king, the Rebbe is saying, who should be our king today? The king should be a great rabbi who you look up to for your spiritual inspiration. And that should be, and our lives should be a reflection of that. We should turn to this great spiritual leader and try to be inspired by them to come closer to Hashem. And so that's why I think the Rebbe was trying to give this message to his Hasidim, and that it wasn't for himself. He took nothing for himself, but he was trying to say that this is how we could create, even living wherever we are. You could be living in communist Russia, but you could be living in a great kingdom with your Rebbe, with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Your Rebbe, you're serving him. He's your king. Your king is not, or whatever it was, whoever it was, Brezhnev or Gorbachev. Your king is not Putin. Your king is your spiritual guide. So that's the message. That's the message that he was saying. That's the message that he was saying. So I want to pause here. Let me stop. If anybody has any questions about this powerful, powerful message of the Rebbe.